The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. I want to start these proceedings by acknowledging that we're here on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and that these lands were never ceded. Pay my respects to all elders past and present and all First Nations people here today. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Ernest Coe. Ernest is a historian with the Faculty of Arts and Design here at the University of Canberra. Originally from Singapore, he's previously held research fellowships at the University of Washington and Beijing University, and is the author and editor of several books, including Diaspora at War, Oral History and Memory in Southeast Asia, and the Pacific War. He's also helped write and produce several documentaries, including the Emmy-nominated program, The Exiles, which was with Tom St. John Gray. Please join me in welcoming Ernest.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone here online for taking time out of your schedules to be here at my presentation. So this research is really a spin-off from a documentary that I helped write and produce a couple of years ago now. So in that spirit, I'd like to begin my paper today with a story to set the scene. Now, a story needs a name, so we'll just call this one Lucky Laffy. On the morning of 16th April 1945, the American destroyer USS Laffy found itself operating off the coast of the Japanese island of Okinawa as part of a screening force protecting the main invasion fleet. The Laffy featured a crew of 336 mariners. Now, contrary to what we might imagine, read, or see on television or in the movies about the Second World War, warships like the Laffy were often quite cosmopolitan spaces, a reality of sharp wartime labor shortages in the US, British, and Australian navies. Apart from white, African-American, and Latino sailors, the Laffy's crew was also made up of Filipinos, Malays, and Chinese. On shore, they led separate lives. On board, they lived, fought, and died alongside one another. Ahmad bin Osman was one such non-white sailor on the Laffy. Originally from Singapore, he was part of the crew of a passenger liner that had evacuated European civilians from the British colony to Australia after the Japanese invasion in December 1941. Arriving in Fremantle, Ahmad was classed as a friendly alien. Like thousands of other aliens from Asia who had arrived in similar fashion, he was then recruited by the Australian Navy. When that contract expired in late 1944, he enlisted again, this time with the US Navy, and found himself posted to the Laffy. His ties with Australia remained strong, however. Whilst on shore leave in Sydney, he had met and then married an Anglo-Australian woman by the name of Phyllis Frater. They would go on to have 2 children by the war's end, joining Phyllis's 3 other sons from an earlier marriage. That April morning, however, Australia was likely far from Ahmad's mind. At around 8:42 a.m. local time, the screen came under attack by around 100 Japanese aircraft flown by suicide pilots. Several planes made it past the wall of flak, and the Laffy was struck 6 times. The first 2 aircraft grazed the fore and aft turrets before plunging into the ocean. The next 3 crashed into the ship's hull. And the last, the most devastating hit of all, struck the main superstructure. 32 members of the Laffey's crew were killed in the attack, and a further 71 were wounded, so about a third of the ship's crew. Now, through sheer luck, Ahmad escaped with only comparatively minor injuries. The destroyer also somehow managed to stay afloat. It earned the unenviable US Navy and indeed sort of world record for surviving the most number of hits from suicide aircraft, and the nickname Lucky Laffey was bestowed upon it. But 4 other vessels in the screening force that day were not so lucky. The dead were just some of the 80,000 Allied casualties in the battle for Okinawa. Ahmad would survive the war and sought to settle in Australia to build a new life. But in 1947, he, along with 30,000 other Asian war refugees in Australia, including several thousand who had served in the Australian or Allied militaries, many of whom had married locally and had children in those marriages, was deported from the country under the framework of the White Australia policy. In a scenario replicated across hundreds of affected families, Ahmad's wife, Phyllis, decided to go with him, but was forced to abandon her 3 boys from a previous marriage. As you can see from this letter, from Phyllis to her aunt Belle, poignantly and painfully held in the family for over 80 years. The boys never saw their mother again. Now, there are at least 2 salient points that arise from mapping a social history of the moment. The first is there still remains a lack of understanding around Asian involvement in the Allied military, especially Australia's military, during the Second World War. Following that, there's also a wider lack of understanding about the experiences of Australia's Asian communities and their interactions with and impact on the broader contours of Australian history that emerge from this crucial wartime and immediate post-war period. And we learn something new when we map out the intricacies of their lived experiences. At the micro level, we gain a nuanced understanding about the complicated tapestry of everyday life in a not-so-white Australia. At the macro level, where Asian immigration is concerned, we begin to see public support for the White Australia policy start to soften in the immediate post-war era, at least in part due to the contributions made by Asians serving during the war, although the extent to which their service garnered goodwill was uneven and changed depending on where in the country one looked. Regardless, there was a public backlash that emerged when their deportations and the cases that they pled before the courts were reported in the newspapers. And amidst the rhetoric of intermarriage and service to Australia, we see a very significant pushback. The 1949 federal elections that Labor lost didn't turn on the issue of Asian deportations, of course, but it's noteworthy that the returning Menzies government ceased all efforts to deport Asian war refugees shortly after coming to power. And in fact, it took steps to allow the return of several who had already been deported under the previous governments. Now, in my paper today, I want to look at the experiences of Australia's Asian troops through this framework: arrival through historical accidents, engagement into military service for the war efforts, and then post-war socio-political rupture as the federal government and local communities often emerged at different ends of competing ideas of what to do with this community. Australia's Asian troops were drawn from 2 main communities. The first were the wartime refugees who had arrived with Allied vessels fleeing Southeast Asia. I've covered this group elsewhere and in the documentary The Exiles, so I shan't revisit this group's experiences today, except for context and contrast. The second group was drawn from the Asian community that was already present in Australia before the outbreak of the war, specifically as part of the pearling industry along Australia's north coast, clustered around Broome and the Torres Strait. And I want to focus on this latter group today. So there's some excellent work that has examined Australia's pearling industry, and in particular the use of Japanese and East Indies divers in the 19th and 20th centuries. Perhaps the most significant of these being the work of Julia Martinez and Adrian Vickers for the Indies divers. But briefly, from the mid-19th century onwards, pearling had become an important part of Australia's export industry. Pearling was not just about the pearls themselves for jewelry. It was also common to use pearl shells as buttons, buckles, and ornamental items in the era's fashion. And indeed, that was where the bulk of the money was made. By the start of the 20th century, pearl shell was Australia's fourth largest export industry after gold, timber, and wool. And between 1900 and 1914, Australia supplied over half of the world's pearl shell. Now, in the early days of pearling, most pearl shell was found in the shallows, but with aggressive harvesting, this quickly changed. And before long, pearling could only be done in deeper, more treacherous waters, sometimes as deep as 45 meters in depth. One of the earliest practices by the pearling industry was using kidnapped or coerced indigenous women as divers. Many of these women were pregnant because of the belief that pregnant women had greater lung capacity and therefore could dive deeper than men. This, needless to say, resulted in the deaths of many indigenous women until their use was effectively banned by the Western Australian government in 1871. And so indentured Asian labor became the legally acceptable solution from then on. The equipment used by pearl shell divers around the turn of the 20th century was functional at best. They wore suits of canvas and steel, capped by a bolted copper helmet. Divers were connected to the surface by a long rubber hose, and a crew member on the lugger was responsible for pumping air by hand to the diver. There was little scientific understanding of divers' paralysis other than the colloquial term given to it by mariners, the bends, which is caused by nitrogen entering the blood and bodily tissues if a diver ascended too quickly to the surface. Other dangers were more known but no less deadly. Sharks, underwater hazards such as coral around which hoses could be ensnared, and cyclones which destroyed pearl luggers and entire crews. The death rate was therefore catastrophically high. Around a third of divers died working. Perhaps the best way to sum up the conditions that a pearler faced is to turn to the observation made by the Royal Commission into pearl diving in 1916. I won't read the quote out here, but the core phrase that stands out there is, and I'm paraphrasing, the life of pearling is incompatible for European workers. It's not meant for European lives. Now, the Royal Commission didn't recommend a ban on any aspect of the practice. It simply said that it was so hazardous that only non-Europeans should work in these jobs, thereby formalizing a carve-out in the White Australia policy for pearl shell divers. By the eve of the Second World War, there were approximately 3,000 Asian pearl shell divers living in Australia's north. Just under half of them were Japanese, with the remainder being of Malay, Chinese, or Filipino descent. When war broke out in Asia in December 1941, with a small population of around 7 million at the start of the war, and with large numbers of troops already committed in service of empire overseas, the Curtin government turned to what labor it could find onshore to fill the gaps. There were around 5,000 sailors who had crewed the evacuating ships from Southeast Asia. When they arrived, these sailors were classed as aliens, and as we've seen already, they were held in internment camps, at least initially. And as the labor shortage grew more acute, these mariners were given a choice: enlist or remain interned for the rest of the war. Unsurprisingly, most decided to enlist. For those who did not, later regulations were introduced that made laboring work compulsory anyway for all friendly male aliens. From mid-1942 onwards, the US Navy also began recruiting actively from this pool of labor. Now, not only did the war refugees alleviate practical issues of labor shortages, they were often also cheaper compared to their white counterparts. Asian sailors were typically paid around half the rates of white sailors, and apart from the US Navy, none of the other allied navies paid Asian sailors the war risk bonus that was paid to white sailors. Now, if an alien did not have specific skills, they were sent to one of the labor companies established by the Australian Army, and there were 39 such companies, 11 of which were comprised entirely of aliens. Each company was made up of 400 men, led by 15 white officers, and they were responsible for a whole range of general laboring tasks, such as the construction of pontoon bridges for use during amphibious assaults, building airstrips and radar sites, and so on. So the pearl shell divers represented the other principal source of skilled labor for the Australian military, and in many ways they made for even more ideal recruits. They were deep sea divers, they were fluent in the local languages of the Malay archipelago, they were often aware of local geography and customs, they were physically very fit, by virtue of the work that they were doing, they also faced very real risks to their lives every day with great calm. Perhaps the best way for us to understand how all of these came together is to take a closer look at some of the lives of these divers. Samsudin bin Khatib was born in Singapore in 1918, and his early life is really sketchy because he doesn't really enter into many colonial records until later on. But we know that his mother was named Timoret, that he had listed his birth date as the 15th of June, that he was unmarried at the time of enlistment, and that by 1937 he had moved to Sumatra and was a fisherman. He was recruited as a pearl shell diver that year and relocated to Broome. 5 years later, in June 1942, he enlisted into the Australian Army's 23rd Labour Company. By late 1943, as the tide of the war turned in favor of the Allies, the need for intelligence gathering and acts of sabotage to damage the Japanese war effort gave pearl divers like Samsudin a new kind of appeal for the Australian military. White Australian commandos who were inserted into Borneo and elsewhere in Japanese-held Malay archipelago lacked the advantages of local knowledge and language that the pearl divers had, and couldn't blend into the local population for obvious reasons, with many quickly being captured or killed. In light of that, Malay, Chinese, and Filipino divers like Samsudin were recruited into a specialist commando unit in the Australian Navy known as the Z Special Unit. The divers were promised naturalization and an end to their indenture as incentives to join the commando force. As we will see, for many, neither would eventuate. Samsudin trained at the Water Commando School in Queensland for 6 months before being inserted behind enemy lines in November 1944. According to his service records, he spent nearly 200 days in northern Borneo, damaging transport infrastructure such as railway lines and bridges, poisoning local garrisons' food and water supplies, and gathering intelligence on ship movements, which is fed on to US submarines. In similar fashion, another indentured pearl diver, Abu Qasim bin Mara, also found himself recruited into the Z Special Unit. Abu Qasim had arrived in Broome in 1933 as a diver, and by the outbreak of the war, he was living with his long-term partner, Patricia Gewin, an indigenous woman with whom he had 2 daughters. They had applied to marry, but the Western Australian Protector of Aborigines had denied them permission. Qasim and his Timor Chinese comrade, Tay Sun Hin, so Qasim is on the left and Tay is on the right at the bottom of that photo, were recruited and trained also at the Water Commando School in Queensland in 1944 before being parachuted into Sarawak in 1945. Apart from intelligence gathering, Qasim and Tay conducted assassinations and raids on Japanese outposts. Qasim's service records show that he was wounded in hand-to-hand combat during one such raid. Now, the intelligence provided by the divers turned commandos is easy to understate. By the start of 1945, less than 1% of the crude oil leaving Japan's Southeast Asian colonies was arriving in Japanese ports. Most of the vessels carrying oil were sunk by US submarines in one of the most ruthlessly effective interdiction campaigns of the war. This meant that what remained of the Japanese Navy was left moored in harbors with insufficient fuel to threaten Allied naval landings, and Japanese aircraft were similarly starved of gasoline. The big picture military history explanation is that Japanese merchant vessels did not travel in convoys with protection from Japanese warships and therefore made very easy targets. But in an era before aerial reconnaissance could take days to collect and analyze, US submarines knew the departure schedule of every vessel leaving Borneo because of the near real-time intelligence provided by teams on the ground, like the Z Special Unit. And they therefore knew exactly when and where to lie in wait for their prey. Now, if there was any hope that by the end of the war in August 1945, that would bring about a change in the fortunes, in the lives, and the status of the pearl divers, it was quickly dashed. Following his injuries, Abu Qasim was repatriated to Australia in December that year, but was already desperately frail from his wounds and tropical illnesses. To make matters worse, he was diagnosed with leukemia. He applied for naturalization, as had been promised at the time of enlistment, but was rejected. Too ill to take up his vocation of pearl diving again, the federal government sent him notice that he was to be deported as he was in violation of his indenture contract. He died, however, of leukemia in March 1949 in Perth, whilst his deportation orders were still being processed. The deportation of Abu Qasim and other pearl divers like him were part of a wider action that was unfolding across post-war Australia. Now, I'm not a legal or political historian, and my research doesn't relitigate this story through those frameworks. So I'll merely provide a potted history of the wider context of deportations before making my observations. By the end of 1945, the federal government, and in particular the country's first immigration minister, Arthur Colwell, had made it very clear that it was the government's position to repatriate all wartime refugees of Asian descent back to the region, regardless of war service, if they had married locally or if they had Australian-born children. The majority of Asian wartime refugees accepted this decision. However, several thousand refugees were determined to mount legal challenges. Most of the members of this group were comprised of men who had served in the Australian or Allied militaries, married locally, and had since had children. Amid all of this, the majority of pearl shell divers, even though they weren't strictly wartime refugees, but rather indentured foreign labor, found themselves subject to deportation orders as well. Now, at first blush, it may seem as though that the divers had an even stronger case to remain in the country. As we saw earlier, they had been promised naturalization if they served in the commando units, and they had an economic relevance since before the war. Here, the story of what happened to Samsudin bin Khatib is both illustrative as well as indicative of what eventuated and why. So Samsudin was honorably discharged from the Australian Navy in early 1946 and returned to pearl shell diving in Broome whilst applying for naturalization. Records show that he found work with Streeter and Mail, a company specializing in fishing, shipbuilding, and pearl shell diving, owned by two master pearlers, George Street and Arthur Mail. But the price of pearl and pearl shell had collapsed after the war. A large part of this was due to the disruption of pearl shell production. Nearly half of the divers in Australia were Japanese, and so they were interned during the war. The remainder were recruited into either the commando unit or into Allied labor companies, and so pearl luggers sat moored in Broome for the duration of the conflict. Clothing manufacturers turned to other options. These new options for fashion included a recent invention, plastic buttons, which had begun to appear in the interwar years, and by 1945, clothes manufacturers had fully embraced synthetic buttons from manufacturers in the US. All of this combined to mean that the employers in the pearling industry sought to cut the already very low paltry wages paid to the divers. Before the war, divers were paid 12% of proceeds from shell sales. After the war, they were offered just 6%. Unsurprisingly, the divers were not pleased, and so they unionized as the local branch of the Malayan Seamen's Union. Samsudin quickly emerged as a leader among the divers, who demanded 10% of proceeds, and his fellow divers went on strike, indicating that none of them would sign new agreements with master pearlers until their demands were met. This industrial action resulted in him being blacklisted by almost all employers across Australia's north. The official explanation for his rejection from employers was that there were too many divers in Broome. In 1947, he was informed that his application for naturalization had been rejected, and because he was unable to gain employment as a pearl shell diver, he was considered to be in breach of the terms of his admittance into Australia as an indentured worker. Despite support from the Fremantle branch of the Seamen's Union, who made direct representations to the Minister of Immigration, Samsudin was deported to Singapore on 3rd November 1948 on the passenger ship Charon, as you can see from the documentation there. In a twist, following the 1949 federal elections, Samsudin's deportation orders were reversed by the Menzies governments. Tragically, before he could return to Australia, he was killed in an automobile accident in Singapore in December 1950. So here is where the story of the pearl shell divers bifurcates with the story of war refugees being deported from the cities and towns along the East Coast. Whilst the plight of divers received scant coverage in the press, the war refugees along the East Coast of Australia were the beneficiaries of what is, in hindsight, a masterclass of public relations. Now, the drivers of the public advocacy campaign to halt the deportations were primarily the wives of deportees who had tried to raise funds for legal challenges. Several of the women who were married to Chinese sailors had banded together. to form the Australian Wives of Chinese Deportees Association in 1947, although they came to represent non-Chinese sailors as well. And their strategy was pretty simple: keep the focus on the welfare of the Australian-born children, as well as on the war services performed by their husbands in defense of Australia. It worked. They found vocal support from a broad section of Australian society, including, very powerfully, church groups, and were able to mobilize a growing sense of public outrage. By 1948, every major newspaper in the eastern states was filled with daily coverage of the deportations and sympathetic letters to the press criticizing the inhumane decision to deport the men and place their wives in an invidious position. The Wives Association raised nearly £6,000 from donations, which were primarily used to mount legal challenges against the deportations. In contrast, the deportation of the pearl shell divers was framed by both sides as primarily a labor dispute. The news articles covering their deportations only briefly touched on their war service and made no mention at all of their work as commandos, and made no mention of the promises that were made about their indentured work being being removed from the indentured contracts and naturalization as a promise in exchange for service. Unlike the campaign in the cities, the divers were also unable to build the same sense of moral outrage about the impact of deportation on the children of their marriages or partnerships with local women. Several divers, like Abu Qasim, had multiple children in these unions, although the divers were typically not allowed to marry indigenous women in the West and the Northwest. And so these unions were often informal in a legal sense. Regardless, this thread, so pronounced in the eastern states, was completely absent in the coverage of the plight of the pearl divers. Now, there's an uncomfortable observation that's worth making here to arrive at another dimension as to why the divers' plight didn't generate the kind of support that the war refugees along the eastern states enjoyed. The partners of the divers were almost exclusively indigenous women. In contrast, the partners of the war refugees in the eastern states were almost exclusively white. There was almost certainly a racial element as much as a geographical one on how people responded to the plight of the divers, their partners, and their children, along with the decision made to frame this primarily as a labor dispute on the part of the divers as well as the government. Now, there is a bitter sort of irony in that the pearl shell divers were already, in many cases, deeply integrated within their communities in northwestern Australia. They lived in what the American philosopher Gloria Anzaldúa has called the borderlands, liminal, hybrid, fluid geographical spaces where cultures, race, and identities collide. Their presence in that sense had, for decades by the time of the war's end, ran in successful tension against the idea of a white Australia. Yet as the first scaffolds of the white Australia policy began to strain under popular outrage in the eastern states, the support for those of Asian descent challenging their deportations in the northwest and the west of the country was notably, principally for its absence. Establishing conclusively why this is the case is a little bit more difficult, but I flagged a couple of tentative suggestions, the framing of their challenge as a labor dispute and the politics of race being, in my mind, the more decisive influences. Now, one of the things that historians do is seek to understand when and why a community or a society seeks to change their mind about something, be it civil rights, race, gender, or institutions such as marriage, ideas such as immigration policy. And this episode reveals to us that whilst the road to the demise of the White Australia policy was a long one, it would remain in place for another 2 decades after the 1949 elections. For Asians in Australia, the first signs of its mortality were discernible here. During the 1950s, successive Liberal immigration ministers were far more circumspect when overseeing the implementation of the non-European policy. But by the same token, the post-war deportation of Australia's Asian troops from Australia also reminds us to be cautious. when we delve into a social history of Asian experiences in the post-war era, we're reminded that the immediate post-war period, for all of its progressiveness, was not simply a celebratory watershed in Australian immigration history. The ambitious program that Caldwell heralded would indeed transform the country for the better, but it had a darker side to it when viewed from the experiences of Asians in Australia. Last but not least, going back to the disjuncture between historical realities and imagined pasts, this story of war, pearls, and deportations also reminds us of the involvement of Asian personnel in the Allied armed forces during the Second World War. As was the case in Europe and the Atlantic, the use of non-white labor and colonial armies was very much true in Australia and the Pacific as well. There is a broader need for inclusiveness in telling stories about how the country's past has shaped the present. And despite the excellent work undertaken by a number of colleagues in history and its cognate disciplines in recent times, there's still much work to be done. I'd like to sort of open up for questions. I'm a little bit ahead of time, but I felt like, because this is very much a work in progress, I feel very welcome to engage in this material with colleagues in the room who might want to share their observations, perhaps their own sort of insights into the material that I've presented. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ernest. Thanks. That's such fascinating and devastating material too. Look, I want to open the floor for questions or comments. I'll just remind everybody that if you do speak, you are being transmitted via Zoom, and also we're recording this session for later use as a podcast. So you are consenting to your voice being used that way if you speak. And also, this is not a microphone connected to an amplifier. It's a receiver, so you need to use a bit of volume. Anyone like to... Yeah, Artie.
Ernest, thanks. That was amazing. So interesting, incredible stuff, as always. I wanted to ask you about, you spoke about the roles of the wives and their kind of the advocacy on the East Coast. And you also said about how they kept the focus on the children in many ways. And this is a bit of a selfish question because, I'm interested in histories of childhood. Yep. But I was really interested in what kind of stories were told about these children, or how were they presented, and did these children ever get, were they ever asked to say anything about their dads or in these interviews, or kind of, is there anything that we can learn about the history of childhood in this moment as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Artie. The children were quite young at the time of the deportation. So the youngest were often sort of newborns. The oldest would be around 4 to 5. But this won't come as a surprise to yourself in your research. They were not asked questions usually. Usually the questions were asked of the parents. And usually the newspapers were much more focused on the number of children, the fact that they were born in Australia. And in some cases, it was actually quite a lot of dispute. So in one case, for instance, a woman sort of gave birth to her child after she had been returned from Malaya. So what happened was one of these war refugees and his wife were sent to Malaya, but because they were Chinese, when they reached Malaya, they said, no, we don't want to take Chinese, we only take Malay people. So they were sent back to Australia. And off the Gold Coast, the wife gave birth. And so there was some dispute as to what the nationality of the child was. So it was these sorts of things, the technicalities of where they were born. They didn't use terms like anchor babies. Of course, that's much later thing. But there was a sense, certainly from the government's position in how they spoke for children, that they might not necessarily have been legitimate children necessarily for the purposes of considering whether or not their dad should be a citizen. But no, they were never given a voice. It was often just how many children, how young they were. Isn't it a terrible thing? Even the church groups never thought about, well, let's think about the children specifically, except for photo opportunities. So you'll see in all sorts of newspapers, the wives lined up with the children, and just to sort of emphasize the fact that they do exist. But beyond that, very superficially, I'm afraid.
Hey, just really quickly, I was just wondering if we ever get the names of any of these children, and if those names also might give us glimpses into these kind of, maybe the naming practices and how these two cultures were kind of acknowledged in that, if that ever comes through any of these articles as well.
Yeah, so they do quite often. The newspaper articles do have as their captions. I was trying to bring up one of these images very early on. of the Osman family, where they actually have the first names of the children that are sort of represented there. I mean, for the purpose of the documentary, it became quite difficult actually to track where the children were, what their names were, because it was only always exclusively first name. Complicated further by the fact that in sort of Malay families, there isn't strictly a last name. So it just makes sort of tracking, finding out where they were, what happened to them afterwards, a real sort of exercise. But they were given first names quite often to humanize them in the sort of sense that these people have names and there's an age attached to them, but beyond that, nothing else.
Great. Thanks for a really informative and interesting discussion. Just wondering, given how important it is today at official and semi-official levels to see the period immediately after the Second World War as a big progressive move in Australian immigration. It's been reinterpreted as this is where Australian multiculturalism started, aren't we wonderful? Whereas the reality was they were shit scared, to use a technical term, of Japanese and Chinese people after their experience in the Second World War. But that doesn't appear anymore at all. When I was growing up, the history books were more honest. We were really, really scared of the Japanese, so we had to put up with Italians and Polacks and all sorts of people who we considered scum prior to the Second World War that were welcome in Australia after. So it's a real discontinuity that's occurred. So I'm wondering how your research has actually been taken on board, or what sort of pushback there is or incorporated by at the semi-official level, say the Australian War Memorial or the Immigration Department, groups like that, that have stories around this, which are more pleasant stories, but are perhaps not entirely real.
That's a great question. I haven't had any taps on the shoulder from, say, the Australian War Memorial saying, hey, what are you doing here? Or anybody in those sorts of positions. But in terms of presenting to Australian historians, the first response that I tend to get, and this was a response both to the documentary as well as to my own work in research papers such as this, that I had no idea that this was happening at the same time. This is really, as you pointed out, the dominant story now is, this is the sort of unwhitening of Australia. This is the beginning. You have Italians and Greeks all arriving. You have, Colwell's beautiful bolts sort of turning up as well, people who didn't speak English as a first language. And this was that sort of big first step. But of course, at the same time, all of this was happening. So, I mean, it's the material itself is not hidden from public view. So a lot of the material that I pulled up in terms of the documentation for Samsudin, etc., can all be found quite readily on, sort of National Archives' own websites, Western Australia State Library website, and so on. So there is an awareness that in bits and bobs this did happen, but bringing it together as a sort of coherent narrative to challenge that sort of view of 45, this post-war era as being this progressive movement, watershed moment, and so on for Australian immigration, which culminates in the end with the sort of White Australia policy being removed. That's not quite sort of been pushed in that way just yet.
Fee.
Hey, my brain is in a million places with this, so I've got to try and choose something. First off, I am actually really interested if you have connected with Garth over the Australian War Memorial. He's the Indigenous curator. Just because I'm very aware that we've got a concurrent kind of timeline here with Indigenous warriors that have also been swept up into these war efforts and brought back and still under the Aboriginal protective, all of the different, sorry, my brain is so not here today, but the legislation that then required First Nations people to be back on the missions and not being allowed to enter the return services lakes, halls and stuff. So there's a very interesting kind of truth-telling that's happening right now. But the other thing I'm also very curious about as a child of a Vietnam War, actually many tours, he was in the army for 30 years, my father, is how what we were seeing happen at the end of World War II, have you looked at all into how that then impacted both the pacifist reactions to Vietnam as well as the impact of how Australian soldiers were engaging with Vietnamese culture
Mm.
in Vietnam, because there's this kind of racism that's sitting here that's being driven by white Australia policy, I would imagine, has a huge impact on particularly Vietnam, but later wars that we've fought as well, and this idea of the alien and the other, and how people were and weren't received.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Like I said, my head is everywhere, but yeah.
No, it's really good observations. And especially I'll sort of address that first point about the, about the war memorial, as well as sort of the dual timeline as you're talking about, with indigenous troops and then sort of Vietnam pacifism. Sorry, my coffee is wearing out as well. Pacifism during the Vietnam sort of era. I should say also, for context, I'm not an Australian historian. I'm a historian of post-colonial Asia. I focus on Southeast Asia. And I came into this topic firstly when I started researching and finding out that there were all of these repatriations that were taking place. And the entry point for me was these unsuccessful repatriations, like the one that I've just talked about, where you have Chinese people being returned to Malaya and the Malayan states saying, no, we don't want more Chinese. We've got too many of them. We are trying to get rid of them, in fact, send them back to China. So off you go back to Australia once again. So I'm sort of learning as I go in terms of where Australian history is concerned. And I'm respectful of the territory established by people who focus on Australian history. And sort of, as I said, this is more of a sort of sideways project for me than is typical, but it's certainly one that I think would be a very useful thing for me to have a look at in terms of how it affects later sort of attitudes, certainly towards later immigrants. One of the families that we interviewed for the documentary that it didn't feature in the presentation today, later on became a very, very active, he resettled into Australia. He and his family became a very active supporter of the Colombo plan. So his family in Wollongong became, or his household in Wollongong became this space where anybody from Malaysia could just come by anytime out of their studies, and they would just have dinner there on the weekends. They would cook Malaysian food, etc. So it became a base of operations for all of these sort of overseas scholars. So in that sense, they were doing their own bit in neutralizing that sort of racism that you were talking about there, not in the Vietnamese context, but certainly in other areas as well. Yeah. But great questions, thank you.
Ernest, I want to ask you about how the Holocaust is being figured at this point in time in 1946, 1947. I mean, it's certainly been referred to in various educational systems over the decades as an example of what racism can lead to.
Yeah.
Were activists, for instance, mobilizing that idea of the Holocaust in relation to these deportations and the kind of racism driving them?
Certainly not based on any evidence that I could find. And it's not that surprising because the Nuremberg trials don't really conclude until 46. That's the first round of them. And then a lot of the writings begin to appear later on. It takes time for that to sort of permeate the vocabulary of everyday life in society as well. So I don't think they were necessarily thinking of the Holocaust or even sort of Japanese committed atrocities, but they were just thinking in the context of protecting Australia from some of the worst things that had been happening during the war. They certainly were aware of what we would now call war crimes, but back then newspapers would call acts of barbarity by Japanese soldiers inflicted on Australian prisoners of war, for instance. So that was used as a sort of legitimizing narrative to say, look at what these Asian soldiers protected us from. Not sure if that answers your question, but then the short answer is that the Holocaust doesn't really appear in that sort of narrative, at least from what I could find.
Yeah, no, that's useful. It helps me rethink how different the Second World War must have looked, in the immediate vicinity of it too.
Yeah, especially since a lot of the worst of the Holocaust only becomes widely known in the decades after. Even the raw numbers of it gets revised time and time again, and people still found it difficult at the time, from what I understand, to appreciate the scale of it, of what had happened. I mean, they knew something horrible and knew industrialized killing had taken place, but then that really only begins to sort of take firmer shape by the early 1950s and onwards, at least in terms of public consciousness. Not sure about in Australia, but I know certainly in the United States, that would be the sort of the general timeline.
Yeah, thank you. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, I think we might draw this session to a close then. Thanks so much, Ernest.
Thanks so much for having me and for the questions.